Hello everyone, we're live from the Antwerp Hof van Leren. Today we invited Professor Sascha Albers to talk about strategic management and multi-market coopetition. We are Lothar and Lara, you're listening to Profcast.
Good morning, Professor Albers.
You're interested in and specialize in international and strategic management. What does that actually mean, or what does that entail?
Well, the critical people would say it entails everything and nothing, but of course that's not true, right? So actually I'm interested in strategic management, and strategic management is looking at why some firms outperform others. So why some firms are persistently better than others, and we try to identify the causes for that. So what do they do different or in a different way from other firms that makes them more profitable, more efficient, more agile than other firms. And that's a very wide field because we have different sources of these competitive advantages that we can identify, lying with the leaders of the firm, lying with the resources of the firm, lying with the regulatory environment of the firms, or the interactions that firms actually engage with governments or regulators, and potentially also cooperation partners. So a lot of things that we can study, and that are of course also highly relevant for managers and stakeholders of firms. And international management then is, for me at least, the extension of strategic management to the international environment, right? So what is the impact of firms operating in Western European countries, in Asian countries, or in North American or South American countries? So there are different environments, different legislation, different cultures, different ways of understanding, of speaking, of prioritizing, of evaluating firm inputs, firm outputs, firm actions, all of these kinds of sorts. And how can organizations deal with these differences in a positive way, but also in negative ways? So at the end, what is it about? It's about looking at, trying to understand the performance of firms in an international context.
And do you also work in companies as an international or strategic manager yourself?
I'm working in the management school as a professor, but also as an academic manager, at least to some part, with engaging with partner universities and partner schools from across the globe, with also colleagues, of course. But I mean, that's not what you ask for, right? I think that's, I see the background in a different way. No, I've not worked in companies as a manager for an extended period of time. I have been an entrepreneur of some sorts, founding a small academic publishing company a while ago, I think 2003. But that has never reached the borders of Germany at that time, so it was a purely domestic company. But at the end we sold it to a large publishing house 15 years later. So that was my practical experience as a manager. And we were only a few people, but it was challenging enough to manage 5 people. So it's only spurred my admiration and my curiosity on how big firms or how big organizations can be effective at the end.
Sascha Albers is doing research about the role of airports in transition towards climate-neutral aviation. So, transport using airplanes is rather polluting. We asked him what solutions he sees for this problem.
Well, there are a couple of potential answers to that question, right? So first of all, the project that you're referring to has just started on lower pollution options, technologies for airports, which is actually also a focus that is a little bit on the side, or was at the sidelines for a long time, because everybody was focusing on airlines and aircraft as the main polluting source. But of course, a lot can also be done on the ground, right? Also with aircraft on the ground, but that's what makes the project a little bit standing out, or apparently eligible for receiving some funding from the European Commission. But then if we talk about reduction of pollution of air transport, then yes, of course, the first pointer is towards airlines and towards aircraft. And then we have a couple of options. The first, and I think the option or the dimension or the solutions that spring to mind very early is always the technology of the aircraft, right? So you say, well, there's kerosene-powered aircraft, and now what can we do in order to reduce the kerosene consumption of these aircraft? Then we have options to develop or to improve, because they're already out there, sustainable aviation fuels, right? They say it's not not fossil fuel based, but based on sustainable sources, biomass, and all these things, which are much more environmentally friendly. Or other options, there's electric, thinking about electric aircraft propulsion. There's discussion on hydrogen hydrogen-powered aircraft. These elements, so different types of fuels on how to propel and bring aircraft to the speed that they need. The second thing on the technological side is always related to reducing the consumption of fuel. I mean, you can also still burn kerosene, but if you reduce the consumption of kerosene per flight, then of course that's also already an improvement. A lot has been done on that already, so that's more about fuel efficiency. And people are thinking about further reducing that, less metal, lighter material, both in the, let's say, in the fuselage, but also with regards to the turbines. The design of aircraft is being questioned, for example, with smaller tail fins, right, to reduce a couple of resistance. So that's all technology. But the other part you also have is, of course, on behavior of people, right? So if there's less demand for air transport, then there will also be less flights. And one problem with air transport is that a lot of the costs that are generated, also ecological costs, are not included into the ticket price that you pay, right? So we are actually talking about the internalization of costs that is not happening. We have in some countries aircraft fuel is still tax exempt, like in Germany, for example, right? So there's some measures that actually favor air transport in comparison to other transport modes, and that would be directed towards changing the behavior of consumers to choose other transport modes. So it's also with us, right? So choosing less the option to go somewhere over long distance via aircraft. I mean, I'm a little bit problematic for me to talk about it because I like flying, I like aircraft, but at the end that's something that we have to consider if we want to reduce pollution coming from aircraft. And a lot of political measures are going into the direction, like carbon tax, the EU emission trading system. These all have been very, I would say, early and wise measures. We talk about the EU emission trading system to increase the costs for emitting CO2, but at the end they were not particularly effective. But the principles have been around. So we have a technological component, and we have a behavioral or social component in that, and both need to be combined as usual to make to achieve the aim that we want to achieve.
Do you have a favorite airline company yourself?
That's a difficult question. As a consumer, I mean, yes. I mean, airlines are. Why do we still have flag carriers in Europe? Right? I mean, why do we still have Swiss Air? Why do we still have Brussels Air? Even though it would be much easier for Lufthansa to say, I mean, you all get the Lufthansa brand, right? So, I mean, if you look at how do mergers and acquisitions work in the United States, then all of the old nice brands, right, like Pan Am or TWA or Eastern Airlines, I mean, they've all vanished. And now it's all Delta, United, or American, right? So it's not Hawaiian, but there's not much more. So with every acquisition, with every consolidation step, the old brands were eliminated. And yes, you get them still on legacy bags or fashion items, but that's about it. And in Europe, that's not the case. I mean, that's one interesting part of international management, right? So here we are not in a domestic setting, but in an international setting, a European setting, yes, but in an international setting. So airline leaders and managers consider it's important to keep these national brands, even though it would be much more efficient from communication perspective, from many different points of view, to just consolidate everything and just establish one brand, much easier. But no, I mean, all KLM, Air France, IAG, Lufthansa, they all have kept their individual brands and still develop them and still kind of market them and still sell them. And that is because we think that all people in a country that have grown up with that brand as the flag carrier or as the relevant carrier feel an attachment to that brand and would turn away, or at least many of them would turn away from that brand if it would not, or from the company if it would not maintain that brand. And therefore, I think everybody loves or has a certain attachment to an airline. Different, I mean, maybe like a beer. Right? So in that sense, yes. Of course, I've grown up with Lufthansa. I've spent some time as an intern at Lufthansa, so I have good relations with Lufthansa. So yes, of course, I like Lufthansa a lot. And it's also a good company to study because of that multi-brand strategy, as I'm also interested in international alliances and cooperation activities between firms, and Lufthansa has been a pioneer of the Star Alliance, so is a pioneer in establishing these large networks of alliances that we have been seeing around since 15 years, 25 years already, so it's actually quite a while. But for a similar reason, I would say I also like a lot Emirates as an airline to study, because they have been very bold. I mean, they're a very young airline. They're a very bold airline. They have the largest fleet of A380s in the world. They are artificially created, you want to say, in the desert to connect the world. They are, I wouldn't say completely ignorant, but they are very cautious in their approach to alliances. So in a certain way, a completely counter-example to the Lufthansa strategy and the Lufthansa values. So from a research perspective, that's very interesting to contrast very successful large organizations that work in very different ways. Coming back to the explanation of outperforming firms.
So during this period of like the war in Ukraine and COVID, I think that strategic management is very important. So do you see some strategic decisions that managers are making right now very typical for this era?
I mean, this is an interesting, and from a researcher you can always say that challenging periods are always very interesting periods. And this period from, let's say, Trump, pandemic, extension of the pandemic, and then the war, the Ukrainian war, is been, you might say, a very interesting period, especially from an international management perspective, because we have all these, I mean, the philosophy of globalization, integration of economies, integration of markets, and ever tighter integration of economies, closer links, higher interdependencies, more efficient sourcing, more efficient access to markets, all these things have been questions with that series of steps, right? Because, I mean, the return of protectionism comes from, I mean, it's associated with the Trump administration, has been around a little bit before. Then Brexit, I forgot Brexit, right? Then you have the pandemic with the lockdowns, and suddenly, you know, nobody was flying, but also not transporting, or you have the lockdown of factories, the disruption of supply chains. And then you have that extension with the war in Ukraine, which is even more extreme on a certain level. And from an economic point of view, you have, as a consequence of that, you have the isolation of Russia. Right? And that is a series of shocks that, I mean, companies have to navigate and have to deal with. And then we've seen that there are always winners and losers of these situations, right? So Amazon was very happy with the pandemic, Netflix as well. So they had a wonderful time. And now that will be the same for let's say, the war or the Russian isolation. And that was also true for the protectionist period there. But if we look at consequences and strategic management relevant decisions there, then you say, well, the first challenge is, and that has been developing through all of these crises, is that you don't want to have interruptions of your supplies or of your distribution, right? Because that's the big problem. Suddenly markets are closed, suddenly you don't get all the equipment that you get, you cannot satisfy the customers, you have to wait for your cars for another year, or you cannot do anything. So that requires a reorientation of supplier selection, of location, of activities of the firm, of the modes of operating or dealing with markets and with suppliers. So that's a big thing on creating actually resilient value chains. And the second thing is, let's say, you might say, an ethical, political problem that comes especially via the Russian crisis, because suddenly it is not acceptable anymore to do business in Russia or with Russia, right? So we have seen a lot of firms that exit the Russian market, which for some firms was a very large, a very important market. And you have those firms that say, we don't want to leave Russia, are suddenly feeling a lot of pressure, and they need to leave the Russian market. And that's, of course, from a strategic point of view, it's very difficult to say, well, should we actually leave that market? Because if we stay, we have a reputation problem. We might face legal actions if somebody comes up with, legislation that penalizes firms that interact with Russia. But we might also alienate our existing customer base, so they start boycotting us. So, we have a threat to lose customers here. But at the same time, if we leave Russia, then we leave Russia. Then the market is lost, and it will be difficult to get back. So that's why you have also these intermediate solutions where you just say, well, we just stop doing advertisements or doing some activities, but we still keep something in Russia. So there's something meddling through, right? It's navigating through that different sets of expectations that you have to deal with. But we've also seen that doesn't work, right? So just I think the last one that's skipped or that cancelled that muddling through was Henkel, who actually wanted to stay in Russia. But I think just was a couple of days ago, they also announced that they'll retreat from the market. And then that's difficult. There's important, difficult decisions to take. And of course, you only take those decisions if you say that what are the chances of reviving the Russian markets in the foreseeable future? And I think many people just don't see that this is happening, right? So then you can also exit and leave your operations alone. So that's a big thing, because we're also looking at market exits. So actually with a PhD student here, we're also looking at processes of market exit, which have also always been associated with failure, right? So if you leave a market, you are shrinking, you are abandoning a market, you haven't been successful on the market. So companies don't like to talk about failures, they don't like to talk about market exits. But still, there are some situations in which market exit might be actually beneficial, because it saves the rest of your company, because it's probably just a legacy market that you don't earn money on anymore, or because of whatever reasons, right? And so in that sense, that Russia case is providing many new cases for market exits, even though, of course, the motivation to leave the market is a completely different one, right? It's not a legacy market, but it's a political pressure, or even if you want an ethical behavior kind of driven market exit.
Okay, you wrote the article Multimarket Coopetition, how the interplay of competition and cooperation affects entry into shared markets. What was that article about?
Cool title,
Please
isn't it?
tell us.
Yeah, of course.
We didn't read it, so...
You didn't read it. You should read it. No. The basis of that article is multi-market competition or multi-point contact. And that is an observation that many firms meet each other in several markets, right? So if you look at General Motors and Volkswagen, right, then they meet each other not only in Belgium and in Germany and in the Netherlands, but also in many other geographical markets. So probably most of the markets, most of the countries around the world, and also in different product markets, which means that they sell different products. So they sell trucks and vans and cars and sports cars and whatever, so different product categories, right? And that is different to the situation than if you only have specialized firms that only sell one type of beer in one type of market. I mean, then their interaction, the competition that they have is concentrated on that particular market, right? So they compete for the same set of customers, they use all the marketing instruments that are there, price, whatever, and then that's a juggling. That is different from that multi-market competition, because if we meet in many different markets, then we actually have different arenas, so to say, in which we can play with each other, right? So if we increase a price for our product in Belgium, or if we decrease the price for a product in the market, if we decrease the price for our product in Belgium, then our competitor can react via matching that price in Belgium or reacting in Belgium, but it can also react on a different market, in Spain or so. Which means that, or not only in Spain, but in many different markets, right? So a certain competitive move, like a price reduction in one market, can lead to a reaction A in other markets and B in many different markets. Which means that if you are facing that choice, say, should I start a price war with that competitor in one market or maybe two markets, you will probably say, maybe not, because I might see retaliation across many of my important other markets, right? It's a little bit like the Russia-NATO play at the moment, right? So it's a threat of retaliation that is suddenly possible by multi-market competitors, which leads to a situation of actually what is called mutual forbearance, meaning that there is comparably little rivalry between them, because everybody knows that if I do something, I might see a retaliation on the other side. So we are not particularly aggressive towards each other. Most important mechanism. There's another mechanism, which is that we also understand the other firm much better, because we have so much interaction on many different markets, so we have more contact points and more information channels to understand what's going on. Now that is established, and that's established theory. And that leads to a certain pattern. It means that if we achieve that situation where your attack is not really attractive for you, then of course that's beneficial for me, because I know, I don't have to bother too much about you, right? But in order to get there, I need to establish these different arenas, right? So we need to establish that situation that we are competing on many different markets. Which means that I will try to achieve this situation. So I will try to enter many markets in which you are also in, so that we can arrive at that situation where we leave each other alone. And beyond that point, it is not particularly attractive to enter additional markets in which you are, because, also getting back to the Cold War logic, right? If I can destroy the world once, then there is only marginal value if I can destroy it twice or thrice, right? So which means that I don't need additional markets, I don't need additional retaliation potential. So in theory, there is an optimal point of multi-market contact where I achieve that. You leave me alone, I leave you alone, we are fine, right? Now, that is completely built on competition logic. It assumes that we are facing each other in every market as competitors. We see that GM and Volkswagen and Nestle and Coca-Cola and Pepsi, like all these large from GE and Siemens, whatever, which are these multi-market competitors, they also have selected cooperation agreements, right? So they are not competitors in every market, they also cooperate. Nestle and Coca-Cola have an agreement on instant drinks that they jointly distribute around the world, right? So there is also an element of cooperation between them. And the question is, how does this cooperation change this balance of we don't touch each other, right? Because you might say, of course it will only strengthen that, because in addition to that, you leave me alone, I leave you alone, we now also have a formal cooperative agreement. We have a formal contract that says we cooperate, we work together, which means that, of course, that only strengthens our non-activity towards each other, right? Or non-aggressiveness towards each other. On the other hand, you could argue, well, that is maybe not the right way of interpreting it, because if we cooperate formally on the instant drinks, for example, then this is a guarantee, and now that's the other interpretation, right? That is a guarantee that you will not retaliate for any action that I am doing on instant drinks, right? So in that sense, you have a safeguard that a part of your retaliation potential will not be used, which then means that could actually be a trigger for more aggressive action. And that is actually what we looked at. How does formal cooperation influence that aggressiveness towards each other by multi-market competitors? And the outcome is, it indeed does reduce that incentive to enter additional markets to achieve the balance, because the cooperation is a substitute for the retaliation potential that you get from entering additional markets. To make the long story short.
This was Profcast with Sascha Albers. Thank you for listening. Do you want to hear more? Then be sure to visit our website uantwerpen.be/profcast.